Hello, everyone. This is going to be Chapter 1, Part 1 of Honors U.S. History. And so we are going to break these up into sections to sort of make it not quite so daunting this year. Let's see how it goes. And we're always going to start with a primary source, something from that time period, a quote or an artifact or something like that to kind of get us to set the scene a little bit. And this is by Chief Seattle of the Duwamish tribe, who actually is from further on in history, but I thought it would be good to start with a Native American quote. Chapter 1 primary source, he once said, "Humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together, all things connect." So in this, we're going to be looking at Native Americans. We are going to be looking at Europeans and the arrival of Europeans in North and Central America. So, the exploration of the Americas, first off by Native Americans and then by European nations later on, was and continues to be one of the most important developments in the history of humanity. This history led to a lot of different things. It impacted America, of course. It impacted Europe. It impacted Africa. It impacted Asia, and so on and so forth. And it impacted how they connected to each other, including how things traded back and forth, plants, animals, people, what we call the Columbian Exchange. The exploration and colonization of the Americans also had a huge impact on all these different groups in different ways with different consequences. So we're going to first look at the first Americans, Native Americans arriving early on. Before the Europeans arrived, there were many different tribes of Native Americans who were the first inhabitants that we know of the Americas. Exactly when they arrived is debatable. That's a good way to start a fist fight in a bar with historians is to ask them when the first Native Americans arrived. We believe it's sometime between 15 to 60,000 years ago. However, it's also believed that the first people arrived one of two ways. They could have come over the Bering Land Bridge during the Ice Age. Sea levels decreased, so some people believe that they were able to kind of walk from Russia to Alaska over a land bridge that usually isn't there these days. Or some people believe that they sort of island hopped from island to island going down the west coast of America until they finally about hit Mexico. Now, the Ice Age eventually ended about 14,000 years ago, and that means one way or another they were stuck here after that. They were here and they could not get back. So, this separated the Americas, North, South, and Central from the rest of the world. So, here we see the Bering Land Bridge connecting Russia and Alaska. Usually, there is seawater between Russia and Alaska, but during the last Great Ice Age, there was land between them. And here are the two different migration routes that we're talking about. The Bering Land Bridge in red, and the island hopping boat people theory of the second migration down there. So, as people of the Americas hunted the large animals to extinction, we used to have a lot of large animals like giant sloths and woolly mammoths and things like that. Eventually, some of them stopped being hunters and gatherers and nomadic, and instead they settled into cities and nations and even empires, while others decided to remain nomadic. The first agricultural communities, we see them popping up in modern-day Mexico about 10,000 years ago, give or take. And they mainly were farming maize, which is corn, squash, and beans. These are sometimes called the Three Sisters because they all sort of help each other grow. Now, pre-Columbian Native Americans had cities, they had trade routes, they had roads, they had large structures, they had pyramids, they had temples. They were not. It used to be sort of the idea when we talked about Native Americans was that they weren't quote unquote civilized because they didn't look and act like and worship like Europeans. However, they were very advanced for what they had in that area. The largest civilization were the Aztecs. They had an empire in central Mexico with the largest city at Tenochtitlan, and the population was up to almost 250,000, which is not a small number, especially for that time period. Now, south of them were the Inca in Peru. They had a population in the millions, and they were connected by roads and bridges. However, like I said, oftentimes if you look at it from a European perspective of that time period back then, they were deemed backwards by arriving Europeans because they didn't have metal tools, machines, gunpowders, monotheistic religions, or achievements in transportation. So here's the Aztec Empire on the left, the Mayans to the right, and the Inca down below. Here's Tenochtitlan, painted in 1519. Now it goes by a different name. We'll get to that in just a second. And here's a Mayan pyramid known as Chichen Itza. This should dissuade you of the idea that they were in any way, quote unquote, backwards during that time period. Now, it's important to realize that when we're talking about Native Americans, we're not talking about one, homogeneous group. We're talking about a very diverse group of tribes and nations and empires, and you can still see them, the remains of them around the country and around the Americas, and they are very different from each other. One of the most interesting, especially for us since we live in the Midwest, you can still see the remains of their earthen mounds, their pyramids. Some of these things are older than the pyramids of Egypt. And for the mound builders of the Mississippi River Valley, you can see them along the river. There were giant cities, and they show evidence of trade connecting the Mississippi Valley to Canada, to the Southwest. We have artifacts that show that they were trading with each other. One of the largest cities of the Mississippians was in Cahokia, Illinois, just over the river from the great city of St. Louis. At its height, about 1200 in the Common Era, it is believed that there are about 10 to 30,000 people living there, which is, again, nothing to sneeze at this time. So here's what Cahokia looked like way back then, and here is what Cahokia looks like now if you drive across the Mississippi River past East St. Louis into Cahokia, Illinois. This is Monk's Mound, the largest remaining mound. It has lost some of its height, but none of its grandeur. Now, in the West, we had places like Arizona. We had the Hopi and the Zuni tribes. They lived in villages for thousands of years. We have archaeological evidence of large family homes, and they've shown that they traded, again, as far away as the Mississippi Valley. We have southwestern Native American artifacts in Cahokia, so that's pretty awesome. Eventually, these civilizations had to migrate or move, possibly due to drought, and they moved sort of further inland. They moved into the desert. They used irrigation to farm in the desert, and they became known when the Spanish came in as the Pueblo, a word meaning small village. So basically, the Spanish named them after the fact that they had these small villages in the desert. Here's the ruins of a Pueblo village in Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. This is, archaeologists have taken a look at this and said it's at least 5 stories high. Now, this is important, again, because we don't have any written records, so we have to go based on archaeological artifacts for this. Now, further up along the Pacific coast, we have hundreds of distinct groups which survive mainly by hunting sea mammals. In the Great Plains, they were mainly nomadic. They survived in agricultural communities. They hunted the American bison, aka the buffalo, and they used every single part of it that we know of. So here is the American bison. When the Spanish and later people came over into the 1800s, the American bison was nearly wiped off the map. They were down to about 1,000 left, and now they're up in the millions. Now, there were hundreds of tribes in the east, from Florida to Canada, and mainly surviving hunting and gathering. However, they were also connected to other tribes. They connected in trade, but they also fought each other sometimes. This is, again, an important idea, the idea of historiography, how we write about history. At first, Native Americans were written about as if they were all just savages. Then, sometime later, they were written about as if they were all peaceful all the time. Neither are true. Now, in order to create peace and order, many of these guys also created what are called confederations, these loosely united groups that sort of banded together for their own mutual protection, but were still distinct individual groups not one large group. One of the most famous is the Iroquois Confederacy, sometimes known as the Great League of Peace in the Northeast. There were five of them: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Onondaga all created this Iroquois Confederacy. They would gather each year for a council to coordinate dealings with other outside groups and to deal with each other, too, and to trade. Of all these groups, like I said, one important takeaway is that there's not the Native Americans any more than there is the Americans today. There is not one giant, group of people. There are many different subgroups within this. And so there's a great amount of diversity. There's a lot of tribes, a lot of religions, and a lot of geographic areas. This meant they also had different reactions to European arrival as well. So here are some of the many, many tribes of the Native Americans, and this is by no means all of them. Now, there were some things they did have in common. One of them is religion. Most of them had ceremonies and rituals as part of their lives. Many believe that spirits could be found all over in rocks and trees and creatures and rivers and everything that's mentioned in Colors of the Wind. This idea that inanimate objects had spirits within them is called animism. Important religious leaders, sometimes called shamans, held positions of power within the tribal societies, and these religious beliefs are still important to many of these nations and tribes up through right about now. So here are some of the Native American spiritual beliefs. Raven and coyote, very important in different areas to different tribes. And another example here is Coyote. This is one of my favorite paintings called High Roller's Eye in the Sky, where we see the southwestern trickster god Coyote dealing cards in a Native American casino to Shiva, Jesus, Buddha, and God. Now, not always, but sometimes in many Native American villages, property and land were assigned to individual families. So there was no your land and my land. There was our land. It was kind of doled out as necessary. Many tribes saw land as a resource, not as a piece of property. And so this method of kind of doling out land is very different from the European ideas of land ownership, where it is very specifically my land or your land. Again, this sort of led to division and conflict and controversy when the Europeans came over. Many tribes also have very strict social orders. Oftentimes, people in power do come from the same families. However, most families don't own many goods. Again, it's not yours and mine, it's more ours. And also, if you're nomadic, you don't want a lot of stuff weighing you down. So often there were gifts given in ceremonies, and they were often expected as parts of transactions. We'll see this when the Native Americans and the Europeans sort of deal with each other. Gifts are almost expected of everybody. So these are some of the things we see with Native Americans that are sort of similar during that time. We also see that many of them are matrilineal as well, meaning the power doesn't go through the father, but through the mother's side of the family, like right here. Many Europeans during the time of Columbus didn't get the whole idea of matrilineal tribes, that power went down the mother's side of the family. That goes against everything that they sort of had come to believe for thousands of years. Men were usually tribal leaders, but women had a very important role in religion and in society. Now, since many of the men were often off hunting, women were generally in charge of the home and of the agriculture surrounding the home in that area. Now, that is what's going on in America. Let's look at Europe before the Europeans got here. Because it's important to realize that Columbus didn't just set off one day. He didn't decide, I'm going to sail west and see what I find. No, he was part of a larger movement going on during this time, this age of European exploration, the age of discovery, sometimes, as it's called. And he was not looking for America. In fact, Columbus, to the end of his life, said, "I didn't find America. I found the West Indies. I found the Indies. I found Asia." But he was not looking for America. He was part of a European trade movement looking towards Asia at that time. They wanted the goods and the spices and the trade going on between Europe and Asia. They were not looking for a new world right there. This European movement towards trades with China and with Asia was also connected to the idea of Christian domination. One of the reasons that Columbus was part of Spain was that they were a large Catholic country, and they were trying to remove the power of the Islamic superiority in some of these areas, especially the Middle East. And remember, Spain had been dominated by Muslim culture and Muslim religion up until about 1492, when Spain was finally reunified in what is called the Reconquista. Now, what's going on over in Asia? The Chinese were some of the first oceanic explorers. By the early 1400s, there was an admiral named Zheng He who led several massive Chinese voyages all the way down to India and into East Africa. However, China wasn't looking to expand that big and that far either. They were seen as so stable, they didn't feel the need to go that far. They weren't looking to America. Instead, it was places like Portugal and then eventually Spain that led Europe into the age of discovery and exploration. So here's Zheng He. One on the left is from an ancient, you know, Qing Dynasty drawing. And on the right is in Dynasty Warriors. Zheng He is still sort of a Chinese national hero up through today. So, Portuguese shipbuilders were able to sort of dominate this time, partially because they had funding. There was a guy called Prince Henry the Navigator who was willing to donate lots of money to exploration and to create colleges and schools that trained people to go exploring. They also built a lot of lightweight, fast, state-of-the-art ships called caravels that allowed them to travel long distances along the coast of Africa. And this created a trade relationship with the powerful Mali Empire of West Africa. Now, as the 1400s continued, these Portuguese sailors continued going south down the West African coast all the way down to the tip of South Africa, and eventually they went down and around and got to places like India. So here's what a caravel looks like. Now, as they traveled further, they started to claim land. The Portuguese started to claim territory off the coast of West Africa, using it as hubs for trade. Soon they started to set up plantation on these islands, mostly for shipping sugar at that time. So it's hard to see them, but here are some of these Portuguese sugar islands: the Azores, the Madeira Islands, the Canary Islands, and Cape Verde off the coast of Western Sahara these days. Now, sugar is not easy to make and to refine, and so part of this story is the story also of African slavery. African slavery had been a long part of African history. Often the enslaved people were either people convicted of crimes, people who could not pay debts, people who had been taken prisoner in wars, and they were sold and enslaved by other African nations. However, African slavery was very different from European slavery. In general, they could own some property, they could marry free persons, and also in general, their children were not considered enslaved as well. They also could sometimes acquire their freedom. Now, with the arrival of the Portuguese, we see that we have a transition from African slavery to European-style slavery. At least 100,000 West African enslaved peoples were sold to Europe and eventually brought westward to the Caribbean. So here's Gorée Island, which is a Portuguese slave island off the coast of West Africa. Later on in the 1400s, we see the Portuguese continued to expand down the coast of Africa. Bartolomeu Dias reached the southern tip of Africa. In 1498, Vasco da Gama sailed all the way down and around the tip of South Africa and back up to India. This made Portugal the big trade empire because they also basically planted their flag and said nobody else except for the Portuguese can travel down and around the west coast of Africa. However, other European nations saw what Portugal was doing and were like, we want in on this. And so they started looking to try to find faster and cheaper and better ways to Asia, and they started looking for their own routes during this time. So here are some of the ones we're talking about. We can see the voyages of both Dias and da Gama. Da Gama, you can see, made it all the way to Calicut in India over there. So they were able to make it down and around the south tip of Africa. Not an easy trip, by the way. The Cape of Good Hope, notoriously bad storms. Now, where does Columbus fit into all this? Christopher Columbus was a sailor. He was an Italian sailor, a Genoese sailor. He was very experienced in traveling both North Africa and in the Mediterranean Sea. And Columbus, who knew the world was round, no matter what your grade school teachers may have taught you, hopefully they no longer teach you that, he thought that if he traveled west, and kept traveling west, he would eventually circle his way around and hit Asia. However, while he was correct that if eventually you travel west, you do hit Asia, he misjudged the circumference and the size of the Earth. And he didn't realize that he had not taken into account that there were two unknown continents in the way. So, Columbus was planning on making this trip west. He offered his services first to the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, and these two had recently unified Spain by pushing out the North African Muslims. This is a time period known as the Reconquista. And he basically said, look, if you give me a few ships, I can head west, I can get trading with Asia, I can make Spain an equal with Portugal in this sort of age of exploration during this time, and we can convert some people too. So here are Ferdinand and Isabella. And here is Christopher Columbus, we think. He was alive from 1451 to 1506 from Genoa. He offered his services both to the Portuguese and to the Spanish. However, the Portuguese said no, or as the Portuguese say, no. He also made 4 trips eventually to the New World. He went back and forth a few times. Now, the interesting thing about Columbus is we don't know what he actually looks like. There are over 70 paintings of Christopher Columbus, and they were all made after his death. Nobody really knows exactly what he looks like. This is one of the famous portraits of Columbus, and it was painted in 1819. The artist never met him. So let's look at Columbus making contact, though. Columbus reached the Caribbean in October of 1492 after sailing for about a little over 30 days out of Europe. On his first voyage, Columbus sailed around the island of Hispaniola. Today, this is modern-day Haiti and Dominican Republic. He traveled around Cuba. Eventually, he was forced to leave some of his men behind after one of his ships sank. But he was able to return to Spain, and as part of it, his evidence of what he had achieved, he brought back several native people. Next year after that, he returned with a large force of men. He and later Spanish fleets would eventually create outposts on many of these Caribbean islands that we're talking about. So you can see the influence of the Spanish being the first people to arrive. We see Cuba, Santo Domingo, Caracas, Cumana. These are all Spanish names right here. Now, Columbus died in 1506, saying that he found a route to Asia. At least he sincerely hoped he had. Many later expeditions, including one of an Italian cartographer named Amerigo Vespucci, confirmed this was not Asia, but 2 entirely new continents. Vespucci, by the way, well known for creating these maps of these 2 new continents, at least as much as he could find. And, that's why we call them America, is because of Amerigo Vespucci. However, Columbus's belief that he had arrived in the East Indies gave way to him calling the people he met there Indios, which is why some people still refer to Native Americans as Indians today. Here, by the way, is Amerigo Vespucci. He gave America its name. Now, Columbus was one of the first to head west. However, there were many that followed him after that. One of the most famous, we have John Cabot. John Cabot was actually an Italian by the name of Giovanni Caboto, but he sailed for the English, and so he changed his name to John Cabot, because I guess it was easier to say. He found some of Canada. He found a newfound land off the coast of Canada in 1497. He was followed by many more Portuguese, English, and French explorers and discoverers and sailors heading west during this time. However, the Spanish were probably the most prolific, that meaning they were the ones who were sending the most people out west. They were looking to increase their wealth. They were looking to expand the number of Catholic believers at this time. We also see that conquerors, known as conquistadores, trekked into Central and South America looking to get rich and looking to give a lot of that money back to the Spanish crown. Now, many were also looking for a way around America. That's also a very important point. Some people were looking to get rich there, other people were looking to get around it instead. Now, in 1519, we see the conquistador Hernan Cortez arrived in the city of Tenochtitlan and captured it. He used his superior firepower, his steel weapons, and he also used the diseases that he brought with him in order to best the local tribes. He also used local tribes that were not friends with the Aztecs to take out the Aztecs. He also used a weapon, like I said, he didn't understand, disease. We'll talk about that more in a second with the Columbian Exchange. A few years later, Francisco Pizarro used very similar tactics to really hit the Incas of Peru very hard. And soon we see that silver and gold from Central and South America were making Spain one of the wealthiest nations in the world. So here's Hernan Cortez, 1485 to 1547. Born in Spain, he was a lawyer and then an explorer. And after the defeat of the Aztecs, he actually became the first governor of New Spain. Now, this trade of goods between the Americas and Europe and Africa is oftentimes known as the Columbian Exchange, and it had a very big impact. This is something to remember right here. This is a very important one. It had a big impact on the world's makeup and the demographics of the world. It changed the plants and the animals and the way people lived around the world, and the way diseases acted as well. We see that all of these things were moving back and forth across the world now, finding new homes and sometimes having major impacts on the ecology and on the population of some of these areas. Of these, the most important for the native peoples was disease. Things such as smallpox killed as much as 90% of the Native American population of that time, if not more. It is perhaps the largest loss of life at one time in world history. And it allowed the Europeans to conquer easily the rest of the Americas. The fact that numbers had dwindled and societies had weakened by disease meant that it was a cakewalk for the Europeans to take much of the rest of the Americas. So here's what the Columbian Exchange looked like. You might want to take a look at this one and remember it for later on. This is a test piece right here.